Get straight onto it. The motion is that Australia and New Zealand should remove the Fiji Government by force. Sydney 1 on the Sydney 2. Sorry.
An easy misconception.
I knew it was Monash 1 and another 2 now. Sorry. Okay. So Sydney 2, Monash 1. I'd like to welcome Al Jones to open the case for you in the team.
Mr. Speaker, the call of the Fijian people in the years of late has been for democratic change, has been a movement towards ethnic consensus that we haven't seen in Fijian history. The answer of the Bainimarama government to that has been to call for increased guided democracy with an increased role of the military in that country. We don't think that guided democracy in Fiji that functionally leads it towards a militarised state that is run by a military that has always sat at behind the government in an unaccountable, undemocratic manner is good enough for Australia and NZ to allow that to occur on their border. We think that they have an obligation to go in and remove this government by force. The model that we're going to be standing behind on the affirmative side in today's debate is obviously an intervention by force by the two countries named in the topic. Surprise, surprise. This would involve a naval and land invasion of Fiji. Functionally, it would primarily involve aerial strikes using the capacity that we already have to bomb targeted military installations in Fiji. We think that this is possible because these are isolated installations in the manner that the Fijian government has always operated in a way that is isolated from the Fijian people. But also we know that all of Fiji's military bases, except for one, are on the island of Suva. So we don't think that this is something that we are incapable of doing. So once we have invaded, we would open up a parliamentary process whereby we would hold free and open elections and open the floor to negotiations on electoral reform. So we think that the content of these could be decided by the Fijian people, but we're open to reforms like national lists, like weighted proportional representation in order to deal with the ethnic tensions there. But moreover, we would open up the debate that Bainimarama has fundamentally shut down on agricultural land distribution and the budget distribution that goes to the military. We think that these are precisely the types of measures that we saw taken by the United States and being quite effective in Samoa in regards to the conflict between the Melanesians and the Polynesians, and we're happy to stand by that type of process being enacted by force in Fiji. I'm going to look at three very simple questions in my speech, and I'm going to prove to you, firstly, why we should do this, secondly, why we can do this, and lastly, why this is a proposal that will lead to long-term stability. So firstly, why should we do this? If we look at the political situation and landscape within Fiji at the moment, as I flagged, we're seeing a movement towards increased military involvement in a guided democracy. There are many manifestations of this that we as the affirmative team are not happy to occur. The first is the shutting down of the free press within Fiji. We've seen the suspension of the 2 daily papers in Fiji, and consequently those editors who were actually sympathetic to Bainimarama up to a couple of years ago, now travelling around into the international community voicing their dissent for the types of political oppression that we see there. We see that the dissent among the populace is fundamentally being crushed. In 2009, the Fijian government killed 20 people when they were protesting, and then when they would protest further and there were thousands of people on the street, we saw the Fijian military use tear gas and kill over 100 people, including children, in that type of uprising. But moreover, we think that the Fijian people have difficulty in voicing a centralised opposition movement because of the dispersed nature of their population, and we're happy, given that this is something that is rising within the Fijian populace, to enable them to more forcefully enact that opposition upon their government. We also think that the other reason why we should do this is because we are unable and have been unable to influence Fiji in any other mechanism, because we've seen that they've promised to hold elections. Most recently they promised that to the EU in 2008 and they reneged within 2 weeks. But in the past they promised that to the US, to Australia and to NZ, and they fundamentally backed down on all of those promises. And as I've said, we've seen them moving further towards guided democracy and not moving towards the reforms that we've been calling for at a diplomatic level. The other reason why we need to do this, and the final reason, is because we think that the military influence is fundamentally unjustifiable in a democratic regime, or what we wish would be a democratic regime. If we look at the military coups, Mr. Speaker, that have occurred in Fiji, we had a coup in 72, a coup in 77, 2 coups in 87, a coup in 93, a coup in 2000, and the most recent Bainimarama coup in 2008. That is a military influence that requires a circuit breaker of an international force to go in and remove that influence. And we fundamentally think that when there is no accountability because they've suspended court rule, when they crush popular dissent, that is fundamentally unable to be enacted without the help of a foreign force. So for the reasons that this is an unconstitutional government, it is an unaccountable government, it does not have the support of the populace, and it is an unsustainable state to have militarised nearby to our great countries, we think that sovereignty should be undermined in this circumstance and that we certainly should invade. So secondly, why can we do this? The Fijian army, Mr. Speaker, stands at 3,500 troops. We don't think that poses particular opposition to us for 5 main reasons. The first is that Fiji has no air force, which is obviously something that means that our targeted aerial strikes of that archipelago will fundamentally not be opposed. Secondly, the Fijian government only has 300 people in its navy, which is not going to be any match for the type of naval invasion that we are able to launch upon them. Thirdly, the weapons that the Fijian army uses are the ones that we gave them in the 1980s. So we have the intelligence in order to be able to oppose them. But moreover, we have the better and more recent versions of those weapons. Fourthly, Australia and NZ have the experience of this type of intervention. We've seen this in the Solomon Islands with Operation Ramsey, which we would say was a harder operation in a warring and more ethnically tense state than Fiji is under the status quo. We saw this be successful. We have this expertise to be able to do this. So those are the 4 first reasons as to why we can practically overpower the government of Fiji. But let's move finally to the 5th reason as to why we can do this, and that is about popular support. There are a number of reasons why we think we would have popular support. The first is that, as I've already flagged, the dissent to the Bainimarama government is fundamentally increasing, and we have seen in recent weeks these protesters calling for such an intervention. When we see them protesting with placards on international television calling for this type of intervention, we think we will gain at least their support. But why will we get other people's support? Firstly, it's because Australian troops are well respected within Fiji. We saw that interventions within Fiji were actually, they didn't want the British to pull out in the beginning. That was quite controversial. So we think that they don't have the type of nationalistic fervour that would rally against an intervention. We think that we can control their infrastructure very easily, which would make them dependent upon our force and would make them realise that they could not functionally oppose us and that they didn't have to rely on their military government. But moreover, we would be reverting back to the most stable part of Fijian history between 2000 and 2008, where Karasa was moving towards the Reconciliation and Unity Bill, the type of ethnic consensus that we want and the type of ethnic consensus that Bainimarama is standing in the way of. So this brings me nicely to the final issue of how we will ensure long-term stability. The first thing that we need to do is provide a circuit breaker for the influence of the military within Fiji, which I've already discussed. We think we do that by firstly controlling their budget and secondly by ensuring that free debate occurs whereby we break the idea that that populace has to rely on the military. But secondly, we think that this gets the type of ethnic consensus that these people are moving towards. We've seen the Fijian Agricultural Union come to the fore and say they are happy to redistribute land, and Bainimarama to say that they are not happy, that he is not happy for them to do this. This is a tipping point that we are at in Fiji. They want this type of ethnic consensus. Bainimarama is standing in their way so that the military does not lose control of the populace. We're not happy for that military to have control of an undemocratic state. That's why we should intervene.
Okay, thanks very much. Now we'll have Victor to open the case for
Ladies and gentlemen, if there's one hard lesson that the West has had to learn in recent years, it's that you can't buy democracy with blood. And that's the proposal that we're getting from the Affirmative team here. What we propose in contrast is that we need to further engage with Fiji, lift the sanctions and the suspension of aid that's been there, and engage in full and frank negotiations to move on a process of building institutions and building government and building aid and building structures of state to work with Bainimarama for change. We have three things I want to look at firstly. Firstly, I want to look at the severity of the situation in Fiji now. Secondly, I want to look at their proposal. And thirdly, I want to look at what they believe will be the solution before moving on to our case. So let's look at what they think is so terrible. What they told us in Fiji is that things haven't been going as well as they might have been a few years ago. And what we will point out, and I'll tell you more in my case, is we actually think Bainimarama has taken Fiji a long way towards ethnic consensus, far further than it has under any previous leader in Fiji, and there are a lot of reasons to think that that will continue. Secondly, they told us that media has been shut down. We point out that the media organisations, the only two that were shut down under a bill that was put forward with Indian support as well to restrict foreign ownership. And these editors were sent out as a result of foreign ownership. But Fiji still has free wireless broadband for all citizens and has a court order that still stands allowing other papers to publish critical material about the government. Then they told us that protesters have died in protests. And we think this is a tragedy. We think it's a tragic loss of life. But protesters have died in protests in England, in Northern Ireland, in Thailand. The fact that people have died in protests is not proof of systematic genocide or oppression in any way that would normally be grounds for devastating military intervention in other countries. And the fact that they just told us that people have been allowed to protest recently and have been seen on TV and haven't been cracked down on military force is proof that this is not the systematic devastation that they are implying. The second thing I want to look at is the solution that they have proposed. What Elle told us with the same cavalier attitude that George Bush approached Iraq is that we can just kill them all, that we can bomb with nuclear strikes every single military base. There are a lot of problems we have with this. The first of those is we don't think 3,500 military lives is a fair price to pay for democracy in this country, because you are the ones who are now killing more people. And sure, you don't like soldiers because they might be propping up a regime that you don't like, but they are lives and they have rights every bit as much as anyone else in this debate, and you are killing them with an unprovoked attack. 3,000 lives in an aerial strike without the chance to defend themselves doesn't stand. But the thing they didn't understand is it won't just end there. Fiji has 6,000 army reserves who live in the cities, who won't die instantaneously in their military strike. And what you'll be left with there is a guerrilla warfare situation, much as I'm going to tell you. Because not only is their circuit breaker not acceptable, because we're not going to pay 3,000 lives to have a circuit breaker, it's not going to work, because they can't get everyone. And Australia and New Zealand will be entrenched in the sort of nasty guerrilla warfare that has destroyed us in other places where we've tried this intervention around the world. I'll tell you more about this later. But finally, let's look at their move towards solutions, because they said if we just come in, destroy the regime and force elections, that we're going to see fantastic, happy, popular support for Australia because they just like us. We have a couple of responses to this. First of all, actually, history lesson, Fiji suffered under British colonialism too, and it was injustices and abuses in the slave and labour trade in Fiji that actually led to them taking independence. Secondly, we think there might be small numbers of protests crying out for this, but the vast majority of Fijians, or rather the majority, 51%, are ethnic Fijians who overwhelmingly support the government of Frank Bainimarama. So don't tell us here that everyone is just going to say, thank you Australia, our saviours. And then they told us it'll be okay because they'll become dependent on us. We think that's bad, because that holds back the progress of democracy in those places. And finally, in terms of ethnic consensus, you'll hear much more from Lee later, but they're creating a void which there is no clear person to fill. So, 3 points that I want to make in constructive. The first of these is more on the military intervention. Why it can't work without devastating loss of life, and the most likely outcome is we will have to pull out prematurely. Secondly, we don't think this will ever deliver a stable government. And thirdly, we think the end point that we're looking for is stability and is democracy, and that will come best by a gentle approach. So let's talk about the armed forces. We've already told you, why sure they might be able to kill the ones in the bases, but that would be devastating and unacceptable. But what they didn't engage with is the fact that there are many armed forces who don't sit in armed bases waiting to be killed. And the Fijian Fijian army is no pushover. Fiji is one of the biggest contributors to foreign peacekeeping missions under the United Nations. Fijian troops have real combat experience in the types of urban environments, which is the conflict that you are likely to see. Because after this initial wave of destruction, when you have done an unprovoked attack on the Fijian army and the Fijian people, we think those remaining members of the armed forces will have a very strong incentive to fight, to uphold what they believe is right. Not only because they think that they've been attacked unproposed, not only because you're attacking a leader that they believe in, but because you've said we need to kill the military, we need the military to circuit break. And that's the harm and why they keep fighting. And that's exactly the sort of fight that Australia can't win easily. Why not? Because our aerial precision guided missiles don't work when you're trying to kill people in villages. If you use them, you kill villages and you turn people against you. And in that guerrilla warfare where we see in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in cities, Australian and New Zealand troops will die. When those troops die, it's not only losses for us, the political will to do this will disappear. The most likely outcome is you will have led to loss of thousands of lives and a peacekeeping mission that is over before it ever achieves its goals. That's devastation. That's guaranteed devastation, and we can't stand for it. The second point I want to make is we don't think there's any chance, really, that they're going to get a stable government under this. I mean, how is imposing democracy going for the West elsewhere in the world? How's it going for us in Afghanistan or Iraq? Similar countries with histories of sectarian tensions and cultural violence where the West has come from outside and attempted to impose democracy. The important thing for them to realise is that elections don't equal democracy. You need to make sure you have built strong institutions of state and built cultural tolerance and understanding first. More than that, we don't think there is any clear or credible leader, as Elle told us, because there is such a history of ethnic tension within these countries. A history of coups, a history of Fijis, the majority Fijian nationals in the Tauke party, etc., who would be overwhelmingly likely to win if there was such an election, because they're 51% of the population, overly nationalistic, and you drive them even further away. So you're not likely to see a heel to race relations. More problematically, if they don't think they would have a good shot at winning that election, we don't think they'll just accept those election results. As they told us, Fiji has a history of coups, it has a history of cultural violence, and an imposed democracy with elections is likely to be marred by violence, and the winner is likely to have their credibility destroyed by the fact that they were put in place in power with a foreign government. So, we don't think they get a solution, and if they do, they're likely to have an oppressive government. But finally, how do we actually get them moving in the right direction? We're not going to come up here and say it's quick, but we think you have to continue to build trust in institutions. And this is where we think Frank Bainimarama has actually done a lot of good in the last 10 years. Firstly, he has brought stability in a way that no previous leader in Fiji has. He has stabilised, for the most part, ethnic violence in a history where that is no mean feat. And we think stability and loss of life should be our first and most important preference here. That is the first and most important right. Secondly, much has been done to build the state. He has created an environment where foreign investment has gone up to $100 million by 2008. He's pushed institutions like independent broadband wireless. He's begun ethnic reconciliation by bringing in the Indian Justice Minister, Mahendra Chaudhry, in order to be Finance Minister for the government. So we think at the end of the day, the quality of life of the people in Fiji is the important thing here, and there are more fundamental rights than ultimate democratic representation, like not dying, like having a government that can bring stability. But more importantly, we think that their mechanism doesn't lead to stable government. We do. Sure, it's slower, but it does it without devastating loss of life, and we get there in the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. Now we'll have Bronwyn for next.
Oh God, sorry. Mr. Speaker, this side of the House and their countermodel wanted us to engage with Fiji, to start giving them foreign aid and to lift the sanctions that are impoverishing the people. Well, so do we. We want that without an oppressive military government that funnels the aids to itself, damages the economic growth of Fiji by inducing capital flight, and moreover, we want to do it with a country that will engage with us. We point to the fact that Australian overtures of friendship and of reconciliation have been rebuffed instrumentally for the past 3 or 4 years. We point to the fact that EU agreements that were struck with Fiji to hold elections were reneged on 2 weeks later, Mr. Chair. We point to the fact that, instrumentally, Bainimarama has not even just refused to come to the table, but he's also refused terms of negotiations. So we have no clue as to what exactly he wants to engage on, Mr. Chair. In my rebuttal today, I'll be talking about whether the buying of Frank Bainimarama's propaganda as to why there is an oppression in Fiji is indeed buying of that propaganda. Secondly, will there be an uprising and chronic loss of life? And finally, does this ensure stability? I'm then going to say that their stability is more likely to be engendered in my substantive material by the stability that we believe we can provide, enumerating the damage that is being done to Fijian civil and economic society with the status quo. So, oppression. This side of the House basically wanted to say, oh no, don't worry about it, they were all perfectly legitimate. You're just overreacting, yeah? It was a foreign ownership law that meant those two newspapers were shut down. There are still foreign-owned media outlets in Fiji. It was just a convenient excuse used by Bainimarama at the time to eject those two particular individuals once they started writing critical editorials. Moreover, they wanted to rely on a Supreme Court ruling to indicate that there was rule of law. A Supreme Court ruling from a Supreme Court that has seen its justices removed at the whim of Frank Bainimarama since he took over. And moreover, we think that, we just don't think we can trust it. They then said those protests aren't that big a deal. People die in protests in England, North Ireland and Thailand. They are not states which, at the time of the deaths, were ruled by the military. They were aberrations in those states, and we don't reasonably think they would have happened again. We think that situation is rife in Fiji. They then said, in a spectacular misunderstanding of some of their substantive material, that if you mention protests in your speech, then they must be able to do them. The protests we talked about are the very ones that are broken up by force, because there is laws in Fiji currently that means there is laws again that you're not allowed to publicly assemble. You cannot congregate. Those are the protests where people held up signs saying "Save us," that had the New Zealand and American flags on them that were subsequently broken up, Mr. Chair. So, pertaining to loss of life, this side of the House basically said, your answer was kill them all. Kill all 3,500 of them. That's not what she said, Victor. That sentence never came out of her mouth. First of all, that was in tension with the rest of their case that then said those troops aren't all on the bases at one time. We don't think we're going to kill all of them, Mr. Chair. But more to the point, we're stopping the mechanism. This side of the House said just killing those people won't get rid of the military. We say you're stopping the mechanism, i.e. the power bases, the actual bases, by which they exercise that power. It is difficult to be a functional military when the majority of your property, of your firepower and your coercive arm has been destroyed by another state. They then said that we could come up against a more difficult fight than we expect. There are several reasons why we think their characterisation of the status quo was a little misleading. They said that Fiji is one of the biggest donors to UN peacekeeping. So it's half of the Horn of Africa. Yeah? Donations to UN peacekeeping involvement is not a good indicator of the quality of your military. It's just that a lot of them are spare at any given moment, given that the population is so conveniently oppressed, Mr. Chair. They then talked about the 6,000 reserves in urban areas. Number one, the rate of military defection in Fiji has skyrocketed. They don't want to be there, and they don't support Frank Bainimarama. Moreover, we said that we're happy with the land war. We recognise that might happen. We think Australians are probably better at counterinsurgency, given their experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. Not that I'm saying this will be comparable. That means that they will be able to do this, Mr. Chair. This side of the House then said people just don't want it. The majority of people in Fiji are native Fijians, so is Bainimarama, that's his power base. That is factually wrong. He is supported by the 44% Indian minority. He's ethnically Melanesian, but he has the support of the Indians. That's his power base, yeah? Which makes it even more significant, Mr. Chair, that in Elle's speech, when she pointed out that the Fijian Agricultural Union had decided to go against Frank Bainimarama and were quashed by him, that is the Indians finally deciding that their supporter, that their voice in the military is dodgy, Mr. Chair. So that was a factual inaccuracy. So, can we create stability? This side of the House wanted to say it's not just an absence of military rule, but it's strong institutions, a culture of civil life, yeah? We say that they had that to a degree Maori in 2000 to 2008. We are reverting them back to that preparedness to have a civic society. They then said you need to build up institutions and like the arms of state that aren't coercive. Absolutely, which is why we proposed a model that was much like what happened in Samoa, whereby we had things like education that was equitable in terms of how it represented those minorities. Yeah? It's why we have a parliamentary commission that decides how people will be elected to that parliament rather than just deciding it for ourselves, Mr. Chair. This side of the House then said, like, the majority will win. Yeah, of course they will. We're trying to impose democracy. But we think the process by which that parliament exists will mean that it's more successful at reaching an outcome that is palatable to all parties in that particular party. They then, in a spectacular buying of the bullshit, Mr. Chair, wanted to talk about how great Bainimarama has been. We want to say very clearly that there is no light at the end of the tunnel for the Bainimarama regime. He has a stranglehold on power, and as I said, hasn't even given us a toehold as to what he wants us to give him. We'll point out that the law which actually tried to impose ethnic stability and ethnic equality was proposed in 2005 by the previous President Karasa, and moreover, the Indian Justice Minister, surprise, surprise, that's not that big a deal because he is supported by the Indian community, and that was just a factual inaccuracy in their case. So, why is it better under our model to have development in Fiji, one of the most impoverished nations in the South Pacific? Well, contrary to what Victor wanted to tell you, foreign direct investment and tourism have both plummeted. Most hedge funds now recommend that you don't invest in Fiji because the military has a strange inclination to seizure of land, which is why they refuse the Fijian Agricultural Union's overtures of friendship. There's been capital flight. Indians don't want to invest in it because they see it as unstable. Polynesians and Melanesians don't want to invest there because they see it as an affront to their ethnic brothers and sisters in a state that is being oppressed. Moreover, even if that's not the reality, that's how a lot of investors perceive Fiji, and that's important when you're talking about movement of money. In April last year, Parmalat, the agricultural giant, which is important because Fiji is 70% of their population are employed in agriculture, reneged on a deal to develop a plant in Fiji because they thought the military was too powerful. They couldn't rely on the court orders of Fiji. It is harming one of their biggest industries. Moreover, as Elle mentioned briefly, the military's power at the moment means that they can demand the lion's share of a tiny GDP budget, Mr. Chair. They have something like $3.4 billion to throw around at any given time that they're doing a budget. Something like $2.5 billion of that tends to go to some form of military rule. They are impoverishing the people by propping up a military regime. Moreover, we think that you are more likely to create democratic society and civic life when you can institute the mechanisms by which that happens, which are utterly absent in the status quo, and which Bainimarama has never even made overtures to creating. So that is those forums of deciding how representation occurs, elections, a mechanism by which we create that civic life and those forms of protest and striking those laws off the books that don't allow people to protest. Mr. Chair, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. This is a state which just months ago said that they were in military rule, and a military rule which has found it perfectly okay to gun down their own citizens and are likely to do it again. Australia and New Zealand have been asked by the very people we're protecting to do this, so let's do it.
Okay, thanks very much. Now we have Ravi.
The rosy assessment that we got from the Affirmative team about just how easy it's going to be could have been taken straight from Donald Rumsfeld's briefing to George Bush before Iraq, ladies and gentlemen. Because that's what we heard, that we're going to somehow go in and we're just going to be able to fix things and somehow install democracy which will fix all the problems. Ignoring that Fiji was a democracy and that, like, George Spate's coup wasn't a military coup, ladies and gentlemen. It was underlying dissatisfaction, a civilian coup. What we've told you is that Frank Bainimarama is actually providing stability, more so than anyone else has been able to for a long, long time. So I'm going to look at a couple of things, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'm going to look at what are the impacts of this kind of attack, and it's not just whether or not we'll be successful, but what the long-term impacts are. Secondly, it's stability, and thirdly, I'm going to ask what happens next. So firstly, in terms of the attack. And we just reject the idea that it's going to be all that easy. Because the point is, this is going to be fought on the ground, on their home turf. You're going to be fighting the Fijians in their streets, ladies and gentlemen. The Fiji military and the Fiji reserves, who are probably smart enough to see this kind of stuff coming, that we're going to move their weapons, ladies and gentlemen, and put some sort of plans in place. But even if they don't, we think you encourage a kind of guerrilla warfare, ladies and gentlemen, the kind that Australia is incredibly bad at fighting at, the kind that we have not been able to do very well, that the West hasn't done very well since Vietnam, ladies and gentlemen, that we haven't been doing well in Iraq, in Afghanistan, ladies and gentlemen, the kinds of harm that go on. These are ongoing problems that hurt your ability to create stability in the long term. They continually undermine exactly what you want, right? Exactly what you want to create, which is peace, and cause the bigger harms. Because the big harms they've been able to point to are like a lack of press freedoms and a weak judiciary. And that's fine, and that's regrettable, ladies and gentlemen, but that is not the big fight. That is not the basis on which we intervene and topple a government. There are so many bigger fights that we need to be fighting, ladies and gentlemen, but these are the kinds of reasons that we want to do it. They wanted to tell us, ladies and gentlemen, that somehow the kind of stability that we're going to get, this kind of attack is simply going to remove Frank Bainimarama, and that he's not really a good person to provide stability, because he's ultimately someone who's supported by Indonesians. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that he is a Melanesian, ladies and gentlemen, supported by Indians, we think provides some hope for the future, and we think it's something that we should be looking towards. So let's move on to look at this idea of stability. And they wanted to tell us that we don't see any kind of investment whatsoever. Bron came up here and her material was all about how there's less investment, that Indians don't want to invest there. Aside from the fact that he's backed by Indians, apparently, that we don't see any investment whatsoever. Aside from the fact that Victor told you, and like you can check in your World Guide as well, guys, there's like $100 million of investment that he himself has bought. And it's the same reason that people invest in places like Egypt, because that place provides stability. But let's take them at their model, right? Let's look at what happens in their kind of situation. How is Iraq going for you in terms of investment, ladies and gentlemen? How is the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan providing you for investment and stuff on the ground? What we're saying on this side of the house, and what we think, is that this kind of circuit breaker is a false analogy. Like, this isn't military coup after military coup like you see somewhere in Thailand, ladies and gentlemen. This is ongoing, deep dissatisfaction by the way that resources are provided. What we think you need to do is to provide them with those resources, right? That's why we want to take off the sanctions, and we want to provide aid, ladies and gentlemen. We want to provide the trade, and get some kind of development on the ground, right? Build those kind of institutions, take away that dissatisfaction that people have, and we think that Bainimarama provides you the best ability to do that. Because under a democracy, right, like under the kind of democracies we've seen in the past, either you're going to get like hardline PNGs, right, hardline majority Melanesian governments, as you've seen in the past, disenfranchising Indians, burning down the stores and businesses that Indians own, ladies and gentlemen, which is what used to happen. Or we think you start seeing Indian people in power controlling all the resources, and you see coups like the one you saw under George Spate, ladies and gentlemen, where he overthrew those governments. We think that ultimately our solution is the best. And we don't accept that the parliamentary democracy in and of itself is somehow going to change things. Like, why is that in and of itself going to change when it didn't work in the past years? Like, the fact that you had a parliamentary democracy under when George Spate overthrew the government, that wasn't enough to stop a coup. What is going to change this time around? What we're giving you is the ability to provide the stability and economic growth and changes on the ground to actually take away people's dissatisfaction. That's the change that we want to provide on this side of the house. They wanted to tell us, well, why should we do this? Like, Bainimarama is just siphoning money off. Like, guys, just because he's a strong man, right? Just because he's taking charge of the military doesn't mean he's like all of them. We actually think he's diverted significant funds on the ground. And the reason he doesn't negotiate is because you're threatening him. Because you're sanctioning him, ladies and gentlemen. That's why he doesn't come to the table. We think if you throw down an offer and say, we're willing to work with you, it's probably going to change things on the ground. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask what actually happens next. Because we think that's actually been ignored in this kind of debate. Because even if everything works perfectly under their model, and they get this kind of parliamentary democracy, we think even then you have problems. The leader that comes to that is tainted and has a lack of credibility because they've come to power on the back of the colonial imperialist, the white people basically, in Australia and New Zealand, ladies and gentlemen. We think you only create the exact environment for another coup in the future. I mean, look at Mugabe. The guy built his reputation around resisting the British. That's where strongmen come from when you come and impose these kinds of leaders, ladies and gentlemen. We point to the fact that in somewhere like Afghanistan, where the current leader, Hamid Karzai, is like widely despised by his local population, despite the fact they voted him in the first place. We think you start to create these kind of hardline policies. So, what do we think? What am I going to look at? I'm going to look at a couple of things. Firstly, I'm going to look at the regional impacts. First I'm going to look at political capital, and secondly, at the regional impacts, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've kind of been saying consistently, this is not the fight that we have to be worried about. This is not a humanitarian crisis. This is not a genocide. There is no risk of terrorism or of a failed state. We actually have a fair amount of stability. These are not the places that we think we should intervene in. Because once you start going into these places, and there's a limited amount of will and a limited amount of interventions that people are willing to tolerate. Australians and New Zealanders tolerated East Timor because they saw serious harms. They tolerated the Solomon Islands intervention because it was on the borderline of becoming a failed state, and the Solomon Islands government called for us to come in there. But when you start going into these kinds of places where there are going to be huge fights, huge loss of life, ladies and gentlemen, we think you create two problems. The first is there's less willingness to go in for interventions that actually matter. When there are actually genocides on the ground, ladies and gentlemen, those things aren't as willing and aren't as likely to get funded. But secondly, and as Victor pointed out, you're less willing to actually support this one in the long term. When we point to the example of Iraq versus Afghanistan, when there's a lack of credibility, people don't want to support it. Look at the way that, the fact that despite we went into Iraq 2 years after Afghanistan, we're pulling out before Afghanistan. Because Americans are sick and tired of Iraq. They didn't think it was a legitimate intervention. We think there's more risk of pulling out. And a botched intervention is worse than anything else, ladies and gentlemen. You leave a fragile state. And that hurts Australia and New Zealand's image in the region, which is my second piece of analysis, ladies and gentlemen. We think one of the worst things that Australia and New Zealand can do is to pretend to play deputy to the United States Sheriff. To pretend to be the tough guy on the block when it comes to the Pacific. And that is the perception that is going around. Because you know what? There's still a lot of memories in places like Papua New Guinea about the colonialism that they suffered under Australia during the 60s and 70s. Like PNG was only independent in 1975. What we'd say is that when Australia and New Zealand go around invading these kind of countries, we think ultimately it hurts their image and they're seen as patronising and colonialist. What are the specific harms of that? Well, firstly, we think Pacific governments are less willing to cooperate. But this is what the government does, this is what Australia and New Zealand do, they're less willing to cooperate and Australia doesn't get its views across. We think broader though, more broadly in the region, there's less willing for cooperation with us. So things like when we need cooperation from countries like the Pacific, but also Malaysia and Indonesia, right, they're less willing to cooperate on things like terrorism, on things like asylum seekers and boat people, ladies and gentlemen, because they don't want to be seen to be joining a colonial power. They don't want to be seen to be in cahoots with someone who is going around and violating the sovereignty of these kind of countries on pretty shaky pretext. Not when there's a genocide, not when there's a huge humanitarian crisis, on a pretty flimsy context, ladies and gentlemen. So what have we told you at the end of the negative case? This is not the fight to be worried about. At the end of the day, there are bigger fights, but this is not going to go as nearly as perfectly as they want. They're going to make stability worse in the long run, ladies and gentlemen. They're going to harm the Fijians on the ground, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we're proud to oppose.
Thanks very much. Now we'll have Daniel.
Mr. Speaker, the opposition have viewed a regime built on lies, tyranny and violence and called that stability. They've called that the best hope of the Fijian people and an ideal government for which they would like to engage. We'd say that's a farce. That's not enough to drown this debate in their bleeding hearts by continual rhetoric of can the West intervene. We say it's not a question even of whether they can, but whether they must intervene to stop a failed state on their borders. We have three questions. Number one, can we leave this man in control of this country? Number two, can we defeat him in a war? Number three, who's best at providing stability in the long term? To this first question about should we allow the current state, the arrangement to exist currently? The biggest thing I've offered here in this debate is it's not a genocide currently occurring within this nation. We have a particularly low threshold to set for when noble powers within a region should intervene to provide stability in other countries. We'd say the fact this is a state where the context of this debate is he's come out and said, I believe in guided democracy, I believe in a continued role of the military instead of a parliament. We think that's enough power for the people. Shows that a militarised and secretive state in an ethnically divided country where we see continual protests despite the fact they're stifled is a ticking time bomb. Yes, guys, it's not entirely collapsed right now, but waiting for that point makes it so much difficult to have the intervention then. We'd say that waiting for the point when they break out into complete violence is a disaster at that particular instance. But further than that, we'd say that the kind of stuff we talked about was pretty bad as was occurring right now. It wasn't a weak judicial system, Ravi, it was the absence of one, insofar as when you can remove justices that disagree with you or overrule their decisions, it is not an independent judiciary with the capacity to limit the power of the state. The second thing we'd say is they said, yeah, sure, there are protests, but there are protests in many places. What we need to do as states is adjudicate the validity of the arguments of those protesters. So while we may not accept that the red shirts and the yellow shirts totally have got it on valid, we think it's pretty fair that the objections that people have made when they come out in force only a week after some of their compatriots have been killed and still have the bravery to stand up against that state and bear banners with our flags on them demanding that we arrive, we can assess the validity of those claims and say, yes, you are victims of oppression, yes, you're demanding and are worthy of our assistance. We don't think that in a country that's we've seen a capital flight from, that is called ultimate stability. And that's something I'm going to deal with a bit later when I analyse further issues about stability. What has been their response to long-term engagement, other than accepting a leader that they recognise as ultimately corrupt, but have shrugged at that particular characterisation? What have they accepted? Was this engagement in the long term? Well, guys, if you do read your World Guide, you'd find out that the EU released its frozen funds and sanctions in 2003, and we've not seen them come to the table with the EU. When they did, they reneged on the promises a few weeks later. We'd say that this country that expels New Zealand and Australian diplomats at a whim anytime we criticise them isn't open for the kind of engagement you guys are talking about. So all you condemn them is to fall down the same trajectory as other states run by militaries and riven by ethnic division, without operating as a circuit breaker. In fact, the very premise of their case is they were allowed us to continue to the point where, apparently, genocide might occur in this country, because that was the only kind of description of genocide or mass crimes against humanity where they ever thought there was need to invade a state that is collapsing. We'd say that this state is on that trajectory, and furthermore, we'd say that the systematic oppression of people and the denial of popular masses is a sufficient ground where they've fundamentally denied democratic engagement. We've heard no response to that other than a flimsy and unspecified model of engagement. Let's talk about whether we can. And I've agreed with the second speaker that we ultimately didn't say that our goal here was to kill the entire military. What we told you is that having two industrialised navies is helpful when you're invading a series of islands that have a navy with the size of 300 troops. We told you that donating to the soldiers to the UN does not mean that you are seeing this kind of combat that they conceded Australians have seen in Iraq and Afghanistan and in other places. We told you that the current status quo, the source of these protests, indeed, was defection from the military in opposition to that particular force, which we're not going to see a guerrilla warfare in this nation, especially since we don't see the highly organised populations you need for house-to-house combat in a guerrilla set. What they've responded to us ultimately within this debate is a facile analogy to Iraq and Afghanistan, premised on two things. One, there'll be a conflict. to their ethnic. We don't think that was sufficient to explain why it would be similar to these particular scenarios. Let me give you a few distinctions. One, manifestly smaller population. Number two, Afghanistan brought down the fucking USSR. We need this distinction when you're talking about Fiji. Number three, not funded by massive networks of international terror. Number four, Iran is not on their border. Number five, we haven't seen like warlords running Fiji for the past 4 decades. Get more serious, guys. If you want to explain to us in your first two substantive speakers why this would degenerate into ethnic conflict in the same way, you need to provide a more compelling analogy than we'd see printed on a label-left t-shirt. We think that ultimately in this debate they had to provide more sophisticated analogies of why this would occur. And second, there was this wholly continued argument premised on the fact that the invasion was going to fail and how that would damage New Zealand and Australia's image. What's New Zealand and Australia's image right now when we are being bullied by a Pacific despot every time he throws our diplomats out when we're pushing for change in a once democratic state? But further to that, we have people praised throughout the region for highly more controversial conflict, like East Timor, like the Solomon Islands, when there were people in opposition to us entering, we're now hailed for our role in building up those particular communities. We'd say it was absurd to say that, like, the entire community of Pacific nations, like have Polynesian populations, wouldn't support us in liberating them from an Indian-backed government. We think it's going to gain our esteem within that region rather than damage it. Further than that, we think that we have the capacity in terms of the SAS being particularly trained, and as I told you, many examples of case studies where we've gone into nations that are similar size, similar economy, similar ethnic conflict, like East Timor and like the Solomon Islands, and have been successful in stabilising those countries within the long term, and we think that they're providing examples of where we could improve from the status quo within those particular nations. Ultimately, we think that on the issue of capacity, it wasn't enough to simply say they had an army. That was true of many nations. We weren't going to bring down every soldier. We weren't going to cost the price of 3,500. What we think we would do is take the institutions in a highly centralised island in the centre, and as a result of that, provide ultimate stability. Let's move to this final question of how we do provide stability in the long term. What they've said is that that this is an Indian-backed government is evidence of the fact this guy is reaching out to Indians. No, it's evidence of the fact he's a megalomaniacal, and knew the only way to gain power was to get the richest people in the country on his side. The fact that the Indians now oppose him is a sign they don't think he's pursuing these interests, especially when they were like, we're willing to give some lands back to the Polynesians, and he wouldn't even let them, because ultimately his interest is not Indians, it's not Melanesians, ultimately his interest is himself, and securing continued power for the military. We'd say it was wrong for them to say that this is distinct, this wasn't even a military coup, because George Speight wasn't a member of the military. Because that's a totally different coup that occurred in 2000. We're talking about one that occurred more recently, and we'd say that ultimately that this is creating conflict in that country. The distinction we're going to have here in this debate, Mr. Speaker, is that what we've seen throughout the history, and Elle gave you all the years in which coups have taken place, is like, is the Indians taking over and reaching out a hand to the Polynesians taking over and reaching a hand to the Indians. So neither feel respected in the new regime. What we're going to be going in as is independent arbiters and reaching out to both groups to engage in open product discussion. And that's what distinguishes our model of democracy from previous models of democracy. If you want to know the benefits of democracy, guys, look at all the countries that have an unfolding discourse of civic life that involve people from different ethnic groups, and as a result of that, grow as a nation. And we gave you examples of how we're going to do that. Number one, a unified curriculum. Number two, invest in economic projects where Indians and Polynesians are relying on each other. In small island economies, as America did in Samoa and Western Samoa, you can convince people to cooperate, because ultimately that cooperation is how you develop as an economy within the long term. Further to that, the only thing they could point to was that it was broadband investment. That's a sign of the reckless spending of this government, since their budget is 4.3 million. Australia can't even afford a national broadband network. We'd say that's exactly the kind of pacifying populist policy that have finally led to a capital flight. Because it was absurd to point to their backbone when we can point to ours and say it agrees with ours on this side. What's more plausible? Are you going to support a military despot that seizes land through the mechanisms of a court? No, you're not. Which is why foreign investment has collapsed within this nation. We fundamentally beg to propose.
Okay, thank you very much. Final sustained speaker is Kieran.
Ladies and gentlemen, we never said that Frank Bainimarama, or Bainimarama, or whatever you want to call him, was perfect. But that was not enough for the opposition to win this debate. Because the real question in this debate is, does a military invasion actually make things better? Does it achieve sustainable development? Does it reduce future violence? Will this lead to better outcomes for the Fijian people? And what we got from the opposition on this was ridiculously simplistic. So I'm going to analyse this through three key questions. Firstly, how do we best achieve sustainable democracy in Fiji, which both teams agree is important? Secondly, will this invasion actually lead to reduced violence in Fiji? Will the opposition actually be able to claim that mission has been accomplished? Number three, what are the regional implications for Australia and New Zealand, which Swain conveniently tried to ignore? Firstly, how do we achieve sustainable democracy in Fiji? We've been really clear on this point. The precondition for democracy is consistent stability. You don't get democracy overnight. And every attempt we've seen to try and impose democracy from the top down in Iraq, in Afghanistan, hasn't worked as quickly as people suggested. So let's look at this first question within this thing. Is it legitimate to overthrow this regime? And we've argued that it's incredibly rare for a state to go into another state and topple the regime. We think there's really, really good reasons for that. We say when you topple a regime, you increase the prospect of sustained warfare as different ethnic groups compete for power in the new state, as the military, which has been toppled, competes to preserve its hold over the country. We say when you have such a high risk of sustained warfare, you better be damn sure that what you're proposing is going to be best for the Fijian people. So what we've heard from the opposition is an invasion with no credibility whatsoever. There's no UN mandate. You have Australian forces who are seen as having this post-colonial legacy coming in and actually killing Fijians, ladies and gentlemen. We question whether this is going to have the credibility that's going to lead to the wonderful outcomes they suggested. So let's look at this idea of whether it's legitimate in this particular situation to intervene. We've been very clear about the reality of Bainimarama. We've argued that he's just not as harmful as the opposition has suggested, ladies and gentlemen. We've shown you how he appointed Mahendra Chaudhry, the former Indian Prime Minister, as the Finance Minister, and they tried to dismiss this. It's just like, bullshit, why do we care about that? We say that's massive, ladies and gentlemen, when it's been so hard to get a multi-ethnic democracy, or any kind of multi-ethnic state in Fiji, ladies and gentlemen, to incorporate one of the most prominent Indians, ladies and gentlemen, in the government. We think that's crucial, because we think for Fiji to be sustainable in the future, you need to have an arrangement where Indians are accommodated within the government. We say Bainimarama, whatever his name is, has taken an important step in that direction, ladies and gentlemen. We've pointed to the economic development which you've seen, ladies and gentlemen. We want to accelerate that through reducing this freeze on aid. We've also talked about the limited ethnic violence, ladies and gentlemen. We say the situation may not be perfect right now, but it's much better than in the past, ladies and gentlemen. What you saw under the days of George Speight, ladies and gentlemen, is huge amounts of ethnic tension, massive attacks on Indians, ladies and gentlemen. We say Bainimarama has been able to put a lid on this, ladies and gentlemen, through military control. And we're happy to support that, because we say that kind of stability is crucial to protecting the most vulnerable people within Fiji. Ethnic Indians, ladies and gentlemen, who face the serious risk of sustained warfare from Fijians who believe that they've had too much power for too long. We say Bainimarama helps reduce that prospect, helps reduce violence, ladies and gentlemen. So if we overthrow him, what happens next? What we've heard from this opposition is that you get free elections, you get an electoral commission, everything's going to be great. That's absolutely rubbish. So let's look at why that is. Once you have a post-invasion state, say you manage to topple him, you get a massive power vacuum, ladies and gentlemen. And in a state like Fiji, you don't have a clear, credible alternative like Aung San Suu Kyi to come in and take power. So what does this mean? You say that there's a massive incentive when there's a power vacuum, not to reach across the aisle and like promote a weighted proportional system or whatever the hell they were talking about, ladies and gentlemen, but to impose a situation which suits your particular ethnic group. So the most hardline Fijians are going to try and fight to ensure that their interests are maximised. And that means taking up arms, ladies and gentlemen, to try and ensure they influence the future Fijian state in a way that best suits their interests, ladies and gentlemen. We said that leads to really significant harms, and the reason for that is incompatible interests. We said the most hardline Fijians aren't willing to support, a devolved system where, Indians get 50% of power, ladies and gentlemen. They're not willing to deal with that because they believe that it's ridiculous that Indians should have this much power. So what this means is that you get Indians systematically disenfranchised because there's so much political benefit, ladies and gentlemen, to being the hardest, to crack cracking down to supporting Fijian ethnic interests against the Indians, ladies and gentlemen. That leads to the prospect of more warfare, makes it much harder to get, kind of power sharing that is asserted would arrive. So we say furthermore, you get the most hardline leaders coming through, because every leader doesn't want to be seen as an Australian puppet, ladies and gentlemen. So you say that's an incentive to further the oppression of vulnerable groups like Indians, ladies and gentlemen, to increase the violence against these groups, and that's really harmful for a team that wanted to reduce violence. Furthermore, in terms of this idea of foreign investment, ladies and gentlemen, this is the most rubbish second-speaker material imaginable. We say what investors really want is stability, ladies and gentlemen. Launching an invasion which leads to a protracted civil war isn't stability, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we're willing to trade with a range of countries like Egypt, ladies and gentlemen, because we believe that despite the nature of their regime and the military control, you can still have sustainable investment, which isn't going to be frequently toppled by another government. For sustainable investments, we need to act. So finally, within this theme, how does our plan actually promote democracy? Ladies and gentlemen, democracy takes time, and we've consistently accepted this. The only way to get democracy in the long term is to diffuse ethnic tensions, ladies and gentlemen. We said you need a leader with credibility among both Indians and Fijians, ladies and gentlemen. We say Bainimarama promotes this by actually integrating Indians within his government. We say once you have the kind of elections they wanted, you have to get the most hardline leader who doesn't want to have this multi-ethnic compromise, ladies and gentlemen. And we say furthermore, you need economic development, which our plan does through unfreezing aid, to empower the middle class, ladies and gentlemen, to have more people demanding property rights. We say in the long run, that's how you get democracy, but it takes a lot of time. We don't want to have a solution which actually harms that prospect. So secondly, will this invasion lead to reduced violence in Fiji, ladies and gentlemen? We see the opposition has been really simplistic. They've suggested that Fiji only has a few thousand armed forces, therefore the conflict will be easy. We see the same rhetoric has been seen in a number of other conflicts. And Swain tried to be really tricky here. He's quoted 5 incredibly quick reasons to say this is completely different, which were all ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen. And the reason for that is you see the same factors in Fiji as you saw in Afghanistan and Iraq. In Fiji, you have different ethnic groups that are vying for power, ladies and gentlemen, and willing to use violence after a military government. Same thing in Iraq with the Sunnis and Shiites, ladies and gentlemen. We say that you have the same situation where you have an uncredible invasion force. We say, Australia isn't going to be perceived as the saviour and any new government as completely legitimate, ladies and gentlemen, because it's seen as a post-colonial force coming in to enforce a particular government, ladies and gentlemen. So any new government doesn't have credibility. That's a significant harm. And you say furthermore, you have an incentive for disaffected youth, and that's what happens in these societies, ladies and gentlemen. You have a huge incentive to fight for political power if you're one of these disaffected youth. So we say what you get is asymmetric warfare. Sure, you can defeat the Fijian army base, but how do you stop people fighting in the jungles, ladies and gentlemen, consistently to try and maximise their power? We say people who depended on the Fijian government will continue to do this. The implication is a protracted civil war and making democracy much harder, ladies and gentlemen. That's really harmful. Finally, looking at the regional implications, ladies and gentlemen. What we heard from the opposition is that, the Pacific consequences are fine because, Australia and New Zealand look bad when despots are allowed. We think that's really bullshit, ladies and gentlemen. We actually look at the kind of states we're talking about. You're looking at states like Papua, which have a history of post-colonial oppression. So the biggest thing for them isn't that Fiji has a military ruler, but that Australia is intervening. Australia is imposing a particular solution on these countries. That's what's politically unpopular. That's what makes it harder to really get cooperation, ladies and gentlemen. And we've shown you furthermore that undermines political will within countries like Australia to contribute valuable troops to places like the Solomons where they actually want us there. And we didn't get any response to this material. At the end of this debate, ladies and gentlemen, we've been very clear. It's great to talk about problems in Fiji. We're not saying it's perfect, but their solution has to be better than the status quo. We say it makes everything a heck of a lot worse. Proud to oppose.
Okay, thanks so much. Now we'll have Victor.
Mr. Speaker, it's not surprising that what was debated in this debate was the actual trends in Fiji, whether things were getting better or worse. But what was certain was that the magnitude of harms planted by the AF, even at their worst, were never equivalent to the almost certain loss of life that would either come about from the initial Australian wave of attacks on Fijian institutions, soldiers, and then definitely in the inevitable conflict fighting over. That is why we have an incredibly high burden for when we intervene in countries, because you have to be bloody damn sure that what you're fixing is worse than the current problem that you're actually creating by your solution. And we think that should be clear in this debate. So there are three questions I want to look at in the end. The first of these, unfortunately for Swain, is actually, can we do this? Because can we do it is important, otherwise we do this everywhere. Secondly, is to look at should we do this for Fijian interests? And finally, is to consider Australia's and New Zealand's interests and what we actually have to gain here in this debate. So let's first talk about can we. They told us that we can do this, to quote Elle, because we can bomb all army bases and that will break the circuit. And that sits a little bit at odds with what we got from second and third, which says, no, we won't kill the army. I leave it up to you to decide what they proposed. Either they didn't propose killing the army, in which case they weren't providing the circuit breaker that they told us they were going to give, or they were actually, as Elle said, doing unprovoked strikes on Fijian military institutions throughout the whole country and wiping that army out. That's 3,000 deaths and the blood on the hands of Australia and the Australian armed forces. But more than that, we never thought that would actually work and end it there. We told you there were 6,000 reserves who would be within the cities, and they said, no, these are weak, the fact they're involved in UN peacekeeping doesn't do anything. What we told you is they're experienced in warfare. They have an incentive to fight because you've just attacked and killed their countrymen. And guerrilla warfare in an area that they know back to front is exactly what they know. And Swain tried to say that doesn't sound like Iraq and Afghanistan. I'll tell you that sounds a lot more like Iraq and Afghanistan than going into Somalia or East Timor, where the government told us, please come in and help. This is organised and clear opposition. The cost to us was too high. And we couldn't even guarantee that Australia would stick it out to the end, because as we told you, the political will never existed to actually sustain Australian casualties in this type of guerrilla warfare. So they might not even see the outcome, but there were definitely deaths on our hands on both sides. That wasn't good for Fiji. Secondly, would this be in Fiji's interests in terms of getting a stable and positive government? What they painted for us was a picture that was moving backwards on every front. We disputed this on a number of levels. When it came to backward steps in government, we told you that overall the trend under Bainimarama has been positive, and it was certainly much better than it has been under any previous leader in recent times. That there were still newspapers to go in the country, that there was still unfiltered internet, the sort of thing that hasn't existed previously. More than that, we told you that ethnic tension was actually moving in positive directions, that people were actually being integrated, that Bainimarama was the only leader who's actually shown that he has support from both Fijians and natives. In terms of foreign direct investment, we disputed over fact, but we gave you the logic that investors happily invest in a range of dangerous countries and rogue states as long as there's stability. What we told you more, though, is that we were much more that they couldn't get a credible government because you had parties with entrenched interests and devastating splits on ethnic lines that were never going to be able to agree happily about what to do. And that the most likely outcome was either an illegitimate government that was seen as propped into place by the West, or a majority nationalist government that would oppress the Fijian Indian minority much worse. But more than that, we never bought that Australia could be seen as an independent arbiter. How could they be seen as independent by by Fijians when they have come in and killed people, when they have come in and taken a side? The final question in this debate was about the Australia-New Zealand interests, and they didn't deal with this sufficiently. We told you Australia and New Zealand lose devastatingly when they are seen as being the police in the region. It destroys their ability for cooperation from others. It's not like they said, India will be happy. We thought that was absolutely untrue and would lose power on terrorism and asylum seekers. But more than that, we were told you there were so many other more pressing conflicts, ones where governments were crying out for the resumption of law and order, ones where there was genocide and terrorism, and they destroyed the capital for that, the conflict that was never on the same level. Ladies and gentlemen, international relations is a balance of probability. Neither side could guarantee certainty in Fiji, but we could guarantee certain death if we followed this intervention. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. Now, Elle.
Mr. Speaker, I would sum this debate up as the negative team says stability, the affirmative team says ruthless, bloody oppression by a militaristic leader. The first question I'm going to ask in this reply is the situation in Fiji bad enough for us to invade? I told you in my speech that there is no freedom of press, there is no dissent allowed in the populace, and that there is unacceptable military influence which renders the government unaccountable and undemocratic. Bronwyn told you that foreign investment has collapsed because groups like Parmalat can't be assured that land rights will be respected. Victor then told us, well, it's not that bad because there are other protests. Ravi told us it's not that bad because it's not a genocide, and Kieran told us that it's not perfect. Mr. Speaker, the test of when we invaded any country in this debate was not that they had to be perfect, was not that they had to be committing mass genocide. We told you it was the fact that this was an unconstitutional government that had lost the support of their people and was ruthlessly oppressing their people. That was good enough for us in East Timor, in Samoa and in the Solomon Islands, and we were happy to stand by that principle holding again. So the second question then was the situation okay enough for us to just engage with them? Because even Victor acknowledged that engagement was less efficient. We told you firstly that when we've tried this, they've kicked out our diplomats. Ravi told us then that we were threatening them. So our response to that was, the EU wasn't threatening Fiji when they unfroze their aid in November 2003, and yet Fiji still reneged on the talks in 2008. So engagement was certainly not an effective solution. Given that engagement wasn't going to work, and given that the solution was invasion, because it was bad enough to do that, could we invade this country? I told you we had a superiority of force in a number of different areas. Victor then replied to that by saying that that meant that we would kill all of the 3,500 Fijians. Those reasons I gave you, Mr. Speaker, were a reason as to why we could efficiently overpower that army, not as to reasons as to why we would go on a killing spree once we had already done that. So we think that that was a massive over-exaggeration by Victor. But let's look at the possibility of guerrilla war. First of all, I told you that we could contain that conflict because all but one of these military bases are on the island of Suva. Then we heard about the problem of reservists. I told you that we could control the infrastructure, which would reduce this oppression. Bronwyn told you that the flight from the Fijian army, given the dissent against Bainimarama, has been huge, so we didn't think that this would pose a problem. But then Victor and Ravi wanted to say that, well, Elle, you sound a lot like Rumsfeld and Bush. Problematically for the negative team, the only similarity they could point to was a rhetorical one. Because when we came back with analogies of Samoa and of the Solomon Islands in the way that we had pacified warring and ethnic countries, they had no response. Particularly because Iraq and Afghanistan were an international war against terror, not a peacekeeping mission and a nation-building effort in a small Pacific country. So let's move to this last issue of whether or not we could do this, because did we have the requisite popular support in Fiji? This wasn't a proposal that would have colonial overtones, because we told you that the Fijians were calling for this very intervention, and that was something they never responded to. Then Victor and Ravi told us there's no popular support, therefore they would re-elect an oppressive government and re-elect Bainimarama. This was factually inadequate from the negative team, because Victor told us that Bainimarama represented a majority. That was false because he represents the Indian minority of 44%. That was then dropped by Ravi. But secondly, we told you that they would not re-elect an oppressive government because they wanted ethnic consensus. And the assertions that we brought, according to Kieran, took the form of two examples. The first was Caras's proposal of the Reconciliation and Unity Bill in 2005. And the second was the Fijian Agricultural Union's concession and turning against Bainimarama. The motivation for this consensus was now, and we could act as an international arbiter. The tipping point was now, and engagement was insufficient in that debate. That's why the affirmative won.
Thanks everybody. I'd like you to cross the floor, shake hands and leave the room.
No, thanks. Thank you, Victor.